The village of Thornwood was cloaked in mystery, with the old mill at its heart. Once bustling with activity, the mill now stood abandoned, its windmill blades creaking ominously. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about a curse on the miller's family, who had vanished one night without a trace. They claimed that on quiet nights, you could still hear the miller's daughter, Elsie, singing her lullaby. Jake Sullivan, a skeptic by nature, dismissed these tales as mere superstition. When his friends dared him to spend a night at the old mill, he accepted with a smirk. Armed with a bottle of whiskey and a flashlight, he set off towards the mill as the sun dipped below the horizon. As Jake approached the mill, the air grew colder, an unnatural silence settling over the area. He hesitated, a shiver running down his spine as he took in the sight of the dilapidated structure. The mill's wooden walls were cracked, and the broken windows seemed to stare back at him. Shaking off the unease, he pushed open the heavy door, which groaned loudly on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and a faint metallic tang. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls, casting long, eerie shadows. Jake found a dry spot in the corner and set up camp. He took a swig from his bottle, trying to ignore the oppressive silence. Hours passed, and the whiskey's effects began to make Jake drowsy. Just as he was drifting off, he heard it, a soft, melodic humming, like a lullaby. His eyes flew open, his heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the voice of a young girl. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The humming ceased abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Jake's flashlight wobbled as he swept it across the room, but there was nothing, just the same empty, decaying mill. He chuckled nervously, blaming the whiskey for his fears, but deep down, he knew what he had heard. He shook his head and took another swig, trying to calm his nerves. Yet the unease gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. Minutes dragged by and the quiet grew heavier. Just as Jake was about to convince himself it was all in his head, he heard something else, a faint whispering at the edge of his hearing. It was as if many voices were speaking at once, but too low to make out any words. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, growing louder with each passing second. Jake's hands flew to his ears in a futile attempt to block out the noise. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The whispers only grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar. Jake stumbled to his feet, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. Then as suddenly as they had started, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Jake was left panting, his mind reeling from the auditory assault. He stood frozen, every muscle tensed, straining to hear anything over the pounding of his heart. And then he saw her. In the doorway stood a small figure, a girl no older than 10, with long, matted hair and a tattered dress. Her eyes were wide, but instead of irises, there were only dark voids that seemed to absorb the light. "Elsie?" The name slipped from Jake's lips before he could stop himself. The girl didn't move, didn't blink. She simply stared at him with those hollow eyes. Jake's blood ran cold. Elsie had disappeared over 50 years ago, yet here she was, as real as the fear that gripped his heart. He stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away, casting wild, jittery shadows. Elsie took a silent step forward, her feet making no sound on the rotting wooden floor. Jake's legs refused to move, his body paralyzed by terror. The girl began to hum again, the same lullaby he had heard earlier, but now twisted and malevolent. It burrowed into Jake's mind like a parasite, The room grew colder, and Jake's breath became visible in the frigid air. "Leave me alone," he whispered, though his voice held no conviction. The humming grew louder, more insistent, drowning out his thoughts, his fear, everything. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching and curling like fingers, pulling him downward. Jake tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His vision blurred as the shadows tightened their grip. The last thing he saw, before the darkness claimed him, was Elsie's face, her mouth twisting into a wide, hungry grin, her teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. The next morning, the villagers found Jake's belongings scattered at the entrance to the old mill, but there was no sign of him. They whispered among themselves, shaking their heads sadly. Another fool had fallen prey to the curse of the mill. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, the villagers swore they could hear a new voice joining Elsie's lullaby, a man's voice, crying out in fear, forever lost to the silence of the old mill.